Good evening from India, and it's almost late night for Peter Boyle in Australia. We have friends from South Africa and elsewhere in the world, and across India as well. So, welcome again. And this is the 10th talk in the series about building imaginaries for a resilient and inclusive new world. When this idea evolved in a discussion that Bhargavi and I had, we really didn't think it would come this far. But the fact that we are now in the 10th week and actually thinking of, closing this series in a couple of weeks tells us that there's so much enthusiasm to get things right in this world. As and when we have requested speakers, they have stepped up and, so readily agreed to share their views and in fact share their dreams, I would say, because unless we dream, it's unlikely that we can actually get anything done. So here there's a world which is quite messed up with 200 years of burning fossil fuel and hundreds of years of thinking of aggregating wealth, which in the past century in particular has become clearly demarcated as the capitalist worldview, where capital moves and capital changes resources into material flows and adds value to it. And then we have the problem of that value becoming aggregated in the hands of a few, causing unimaginable disparities. I was reading an article that Peter wrote on the topic of the day, and he says that 2,000 billionaires have as much wealth as the rest of us put together, and we are 5.5 billion people. The disparities are acute in India, for instance, and almost all of the southern countries. But it's no different in the north. And that's very clear in what's happening in the United States. For instance, last year we had Aaron speak to why Black Lives Matter has become such a movement against the administration and against racism. So there's a world which is fraught with all sorts of inconsistencies and inequalities. And clearly the ones who are in power are not willing to let go. They're not willing to look out and say, look, this is not how we should use our political or financial power. In fact, they're planning to aggregate it. One of the most bizarre examples of that was during the pandemic, Mr. Bill Gates pumped in $3.5 million in one of the most unimaginable technologies. Mammary cells were extracted from a woman, and a culture was developed to create mother's milk from that chemical base. Now, as we grew up, we always thought there's this world and we're all one, and in which such things as having a mother is having a mother. It's not something that you go and buy from a supermarket. But the fact that we have an imagination that you can buy mother's milk from a supermarket as a culture speaks to the kind of thinking that capitalism produces. We have this saying in India which is called Atiti Devot Bhava, because we believe Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that whole world is a family. Now, if whole world is a family, then capitalism clearly is not the way in which families work. Families work with a certain sense of socialism, sharing, giving, taking, feeling for each other. That clearly is not happening across the world. And we have, through the pandemic, seen the fortification of not just cities, but homes and countries itself. People are blocked from moving. The virus is blamed for it. And blaming the virus is one part. But if this is the kind of imagination that the pandemic produces, it is really the death of humanism. So I think it's in that context that we asked Peter if he could speak, and he has made a strong case for eco-socialism. And he'll speak, I would say, for 35 minutes, and then we'll take questions. But to briefly introduce Peter Boyle, he's from Australia, Sydney, I believe. And he has been a very, very long-term political activist, and not just on green issues, but on issues of racism, about the Kurdish struggle. And, just imagine any struggle that requires our attention, and Peter has given it his attention. And he's also a political activist and correspondent. I believe you founded, I don't know if I'm right, the Green Left Weekly, an amazingly rich resource of various streams of arguments on how we can actually solve the problem. All we need to do is make sure the 1% or the less than 1% do not define our lives. So how are we going to do that? That's for Peter to tell us. And that's the kind of imagination this series brings to all of us. So again, thank you all for joining in again for the 10th time. And we are very sorry that the Facebook Live is not working today. Some problem between Zoom and Facebook. I hope Mark Zuckerberg has not thrown up a wall there. However, we will record this for those who miss it on Facebook, and it will be available on ESG's website, which is esgindia.org, a few hours after this talk is over. Yeah, so without wasting much more time on intros, let me invite Peter Boyle. Thank you very much for joining us. And yes.
Good evening, everybody from Australia. And thank you very much to Leo and Bagavi and ESG for inviting me to participate in this forum. I want to tell you I'm a very great fan of Greta Thunberg, the young Swedish environmental activist. And it's not only because I guess she symbolizes, the power of a generation in whose hands I think our global future does rest. But also I particularly respect her because she's a very straight speaker. And recently I listened to her 12-chapter podcast, which she has just put up online, and you can find it on Google, I'm sure. And I highly recommend that you listen to it. And I will be referring to a couple of the points that she makes in this podcast in our discussion this evening. Now, one of the things that Thunberg said in this podcast was that one good thing that might come out of the COVID-19 pandemic is that it might have taught the world something about the nature of crisis. And it might have given us collectively some insights in how we should act in an emergency. First of all, I think we've seen this in the pattern all around the world in the pandemic. Our society as a whole is forced to recognize what the really essential services are in society. Oops, I've just got a technical problem here. Yeah. What are the really essential services in society? And secondly, society sees the need to pool its resources and to focus on addressing the urgent needs and allocating resources to that end. And thirdly, a society, as we see in the pandemic, is forced to rapidly change behavior, to adapt to the demands of the new situation. So that's, if you like, 3 lessons from crisis that we can take from COVID-19. Well, in Australia, the COVID-19 pandemic came hot on the heels of another crisis in the form of a huge bushfire that went on for months and that burned through a large section of the most populated part of this very old and dry continent that is Australia. And so, if you like, we had one big crisis followed by another crisis. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit about these fires. You probably heard about it all around the world. They were huge. Altogether, about 12.5 million hectares of bush or forest were burnt. And by comparison, that's almost the total land area of England. You know, I mean, we should compare it to other parts of the world, not just England, but that's one that comes handy. Now, relatively few people died in these bushfires compared to other crises that would happen around the world. Certainly, if a crisis of this nature had happened in the global south, we had 33 people died actually in the fires, but another 445 people died as a result of smoke that completely covered most of the towns and cities for months and months. About 3,000 homes were destroyed, and many people had entire townships had a most traumatic experience when they were forced to basically flee into the sea because the fire just swept, covered all the land. They had to basically stand in the water until it was gone. Approximately 1 billion native animals, so I'm not counting livestock, I'm talking about the native species, were killed. And now as a result, some 750 species are under threat and are considered in need of urgent intervention. So one thing that fire crisis proved to us in Australia, and I think to many other people around the world who watched it on the television screens, is that the climate emergency is no longer something that has to be worried about in the future. The climate emergency is now, and it is already catastrophic. And in this country of Australia, it was not the only major climate catastrophe that had happened recently. Actually, large sections of the agricultural land of Australia have been in severe drought for 2 decades. It is on record, this is the longest series of droughts we've ever had. Our continent's biggest river system has repeatedly gone into crisis. And a few months ago, there were pictures of completely dried up riverbeds, dead fish everywhere. It was shocking everybody. But however, Australia's population is a very urbanized population. Most people live in cities and towns along the coast, and they do not really share the experiences of the relatively small population that lives in the rural areas. But when the fires came, this reached into the towns and the cities along the coast where people do live in. So I think it had a bigger impact on people's consciousness. So for a lot of people who went through this experience of the fires, we could see that this is already the effects of a 0.5% rise, centigrade rise, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution that has been experienced on a global, on average on a global scale. And we're already experiencing a climate catastrophe of this nature. Now in Australia, in a few months, only a few months, most probably a new fire season will begin. It started around September last year, so it's not a long time away. The COVID-19 crisis will still be ongoing. We are beginning to see the first bits of our second wave of infections. The economic impact of the pandemic will be felt much stronger. The unemployment impact is actually just rolling through. Thousands and thousands of jobs are being gone, and they're being announced on a daily basis. So we will be facing multiple and simultaneous and interrelated crises. Now, I think this, as an example I'm giving you from the country I'm in, is going to be the reality all over the world, as climate change gets worse. And I think as the COVID-19 pandemic shows, the rich countries of the world are not going to escape. See, this was, the pandemic had this effect. It was a shock to the rich people in the rich countries of the world, because normally they're not used to being affected by a crisis of this nature. Temperatures around the world are going to basically rise to levels that have not existed for millions of years, and at a speed that the Earth's systems simply cannot adapt to. And I think clearly the world is passing through many tipping points that are irreversibly going to change the Earth's life support systems. In her latest podcast, which I referred to, Greta Thunberg spelt out the situation very bluntly. She said, if all countries were to go through with the emission reduction targets they have set up as goals, we will still be heading for a catastrophic global temperature rise of at least 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. The people in power, she said, have already practically given up on the possibility of handing over a decent future to coming generations. And they've given up without even trying. She said, I know it sounds terrible, but the reality is even worse, because these people in power, even if they wanted to act in line with what is actually needed, and sometimes they do, they can't. That is because, she said, we are already stuck. We are stuck in a system that does not allow it. We have written contracts and business agreements tying us down. It's just simple math, she says. The UN GAP report shows that the world's planned fossil fuel production up to the year 2030 accounts for 120% more than what would be consistent with a target of just a 1.5% centigrade rise. So it just doesn't add up. So she concludes from this. So if we are to avoid a climate catastrophe, we are going to have to make it possible to tear up those contracts, to abandon all these existing deals and agreements on a scale that is hard to imagine today. And that alone requires a whole new way of thinking, since those sort of actions today are not politically, economically, or even legally possible. In short, she sums up, the climate and ecological crisis cannot be solved within today's political and economic systems. That, she says, is not an opinion, that's a fact. Now, this is coming from a person who says, well, she's not really interested in politics. She's only interested in the science of this. And that's very interesting. So what she is saying, this person who is saying, I'm not political, don't give me a political label, she has come to the conclusion, and she wants everybody else to come to the same conclusion, that the capitalist system is blocking a global response to the climate emergency. The capitalist class, along with all the governments that serve it, simply prioritize corporate profit over all else, and in the process are threatening human survival as well as the survival of millions of other animals and plant species. So first of all, let's break it down as to why this is the case. First of all, I think it is a matter of record as well as a matter of theory that capitalism operates on the assumption of unlimited growth. GDP has to go up or we're in crisis, right? The key measurement in this system of progress is not human well-being, let alone human happiness, not ecological balance or environmental health. It's all about producing more to sell more, even if what is produced is rubbish or toxic. That's the objective. It's not about producing to meet social need, but to sell to realize a profit. And secondly, as the point that Leo made in the introduction, wealth has been concentrated to an unprecedented level. That huge concentration of wealth, acting as capital, then uses it to command the lion's shares of the benefit of economic growth, while the majority suffer the consequences. Poverty, war, ecocide. And ecocide, I think, because this concentrated capital is blind, is fundamentally blind in its greed and rapaciousness. Even by some fluke, the majority of the world's billionaires were to suddenly come, get a conscience, so to speak, the greed for the highest return these days is more likely to be governed by an algorithm in a computer, thanks to financialization, than the choice of any one individual. And this is a consequence of the historic accumulation and concentration of capital. And with the time running out, to take the necessary action to avert truly catastrophic climate change. And as Thunberg says, it's about only 8 years left, because you can't keep saying 10 years and 10 years and another 2 years have already gone. So it's 8 years and counting down. Society needs to face up to ending this unsustainable and unconscionable concentration of wealth built through brutal dispossession and exploitation, as history tells us. So my conclusion from this situation is that, if you like, that old slogan of Marx, expropriate the expropriators, while it may still sound ideological, today actually is a practical existential necessity. Society simply cannot do what it needs to survive without challenging capitalism. But it has to be said, that may very well be the fact, but mass consciousness still is a long way from recognizing this reality. So what to do? Well, you know, I don't pretend to have any magical answers. I can only share our thinking as we, you know, as we have gone through the crises that we have experienced in this country. Well, certainly in the wake of the big fires a few months ago, we began to discuss with people and work out what would be some of the key steps that society ought to be able to unite around in order to urgently address the crisis. The first one, which actually surprisingly popular today in Australia, to bring the energy sector back into public hands so that we can rapidly move to 100% renewables within 10 years. And in the process, creating jobs that are green, if you like, and therefore having a just economic transition. That's a very popular demand. The second thing, to make public transport free and frequent and accessible. Again, it's popular. And actually, some countries are beginning to make public transport free. Give the rights, particularly to the land and water, to the First Nations communities that have been dispossessed in our country. Now, this is a sort of a difficult issue because, you know, this is a colonial settler state. The European Australians, you know, came in here and they stole the land of the Indigenous people. But one thing the fire experience has shown people is that there's a lot of knowledge that the Indigenous communities had developed to deal with fire on this continent. And one of them is what they call slow burning. They just carefully create smaller fires at the right time so that it does not impact negatively on nature as a whole. And there's actually been experiments because there are some areas in which this was carried out, and those areas actually survived the fire crisis much better. So there's a huge interest in this and engagement with what was a difficult issue before. Another one was to boost sustainable farming and reforestation and to end the privatization and monopolization of water resources. And this is particularly a popular issue in the rural areas where the impact of the privatization of water supplies, you know, is felt by rural communities in a big way. Smaller farmers, town folk are feeling the pain of that. Another issue, to cut greenhouse gas emissions and to move to renewable energy, as I said, in 10 years. Now, the political parties in this country are playing around with a very slippery concept, which I'm sure you are familiar with there. They talk about going for a net zero greenhouse emissions target by 2050, which is quite a long way away. No way it's going to stop, have the impact that is needed, because it's a dodgy concept. They get the net zero things with all sorts of trickery. You know, they claim they've paid some company to grow plantations in the Philippines or in Africa. You know, various trade-offs are done. and carbon credits are made, and they don't actually do anything to change the situation in terms of emissions in this country. And it's not just a case of actually doing as much as other countries, because I think the reality is, to address climate change, the richest countries have to do more than the poorer countries, than the global south, because otherwise it will just be too unfair and unsustainable. And the final point, which is we would try and see what we could get a broad agreement with, a major push towards energy efficiency and to work towards zero waste. Now, energy efficiency is actually, everybody swears by it, this place, and in our country, and even corporations say they're all interested in it. But zero waste is another one, which is an interesting one. It is very popular with ordinary people because they can see the results. They can see the waste that's piling up. And of late, they've seen how corporations have actually made a business of shipping waste to the third world, to the global south from rich countries. And there's some shocking stories have come true. Well, so we are trying to popularize this and to see if we can build broad mass movements with different sectors of society around these sort of demands. In this context, the major political parties in our country, they all now claim that they accept the reality of the climate crisis. Very hard not to do this after you've been through the 5 crises our country has been through. And yet they're systematically blocking the shift to renewable energy. And this is particularly the case because Australia is a major exporter. It's the world's 3rd largest fossil fuel exporter. And it's currently, I think, moving towards to be the biggest exporter of gas, natural gas in this country. It's some people, you know, the people who are interested in this, they coined the phrase, you know, we are going to become the new Qatar of gas in the world today. So they're very powerful forces, big corporations with a big stake in fossil fuel exports. So they're resisting it, despite saying that they're in favor of climate action. So I think this resistance is actually empowering a popular movements to take the entire energy sector back into public hands, because basically these big corporations are pissing off, to use an Australian term, pissing off large sections of society. And we've seen actually some of the broadest movements against some of these extraction companies. Movements that have united sectors of society that previously didn't work together politically. Farmers, Indigenous people, and city folk. And this is probably the most sustained mass ecological campaign in our country. It's against gas exploitation, against fracking, etc. Now, another issue around which a kind of a movement grew up in a very organic way was a movement around the question of transport. We recognize in our country, in Australia, that transport is the 3rd biggest source of greenhouse emissions. And actually it's the sector of the economy with the fastest growing greenhouse emissions. And yet all our governments, federal and state governments, are actually projecting and promoting and subsidizing multi-billion-dollar road tollway projects and forcing them upon communities that are resisting them, while simultaneously privatizing and cutting back public transport. So we basically have this an organic movement of communities resisting their homes being knocked down to build these huge roadways, together with a pro-public transport campaign. So this is another organic movement that came out from the movement, from the grassroots, which came to the idea that we have to take public transport back into, keep public transport in public hands, you know, and privatize these, or take into public ownership these privatized transport systems that are being promoted. So I think the net result of all this is that while we start with very specific issues and specific demands to deal with different things, we're all coming towards a conclusion that in order to move forward with each of these areas, we are heading in the direction of a democratization of the economy. And I think fundamentally, this is where, movement starts to become very political. Because when you talk about the democratization of the economy, this is when you are talking about an eco-socialist solution rather than a solution to climate change based on a greener capitalism. And I think these are the two counterposed visions for the future that are at play. Strangely, there seems to be a lag between where consciousness is in these grassroots movements that are actually coming to this position of wanting to see a democratization of the economy and the positions of political parties. So even the Greens party in our country, which is significant third party, it's not big enough to be a competitor for government on either the national or the state level. Even it struggles between going for a greener capitalism or going for an eco-socialist vision. So that there's a battle around these two visions for the future in the political sphere, even in the most green part of the political sphere. And I think this is where a lot of the discussion needs to proceed further, because it begins to intersect with many other problems, including a problem which is very important, problem of public confidence. Confidence in being able to carry out change, in being able to build new institutions. This is what's at stake here. Because if we talk about a democratization of the economy, it raises the question of how do you do this? How does community actually have control over the collective resources of society? There is a suspicion of simply handing it over to the big state is not necessarily going to mean a democratization of these economic resources. So what the movements are trying up is a demand for there to be a true power shift and the creation of new democratic institutions that are participatory, that are more than simply going to a ballot box once every 3 or 5 years to choose between different brands who may not have very different politics, who all depend on the funding from big private corporations and are systematically corrupted by those same corporations. So it requires a true participatory democracy to break through this, one that actually does involve the majority of people, truly being involved in deciding how society is run. Does our society then, it poses the question, have the means or the will to build such new systems of people power? I think in the means we can be quite hopeful, because just as technological advances have made the possibilities of moving to renewable energy much easier, it's made renewable energy cheaper and more efficient. And now, in fact, we have a very strange situation that, we have a capitalist market in which renewable energy is competitive with some fossil fuel energies, and we have states moving in to subsidize the fossil fuel sector against the increasingly cheap renewable energy. But we can see technological changes that also make it easier to do participatory democracy. You can actually make decisions more easily. Now we're using technology to have this international forum here, but we can use similar technology to have lots more discussion in society and participation in decision making. We even have the technical means now to do very effective, transparent, moneyless exchange of human labor. So you can actually have systems where you don't have to have money and you can have people working together. We saw some examples of this very interestingly when Greece was thrown into crisis with the debt crisis, and in several cities, systems of barter were used to build cooperative links in society. Now, we do have a problem, I think, of confidence. The decades of capitalist neoliberalism all around the world have significantly lowered public expectations and systematically eroded confidence. Eroded confidence in our capacity to work together, to struggle collectively, to organize, and to achieve change. However, we can draw some optimism from a number of sources. So when I listen to Greta Thunberg's speech, she draws a lot of confidence from her trip to the United States, from seeing the Black Lives Movement, from seeing the high school strikes movement, seeing all these sort of like in the streets movements that have been exploding for a while. And I must say, certainly our experience in this country around the recent explosion of the Black Lives Movement in the United States has been quite extraordinary, because right in the middle of the COVID crisis, when people were actually quite scared to go out, in large numbers, we had the biggest ever demonstrations around Black Lives Matter issue, because it actually is a real issue in Australia, because particularly with Indigenous people, they face a very high rate of death in custody. And it's been one of the big issues, but it's been an issue where you'd get at best 3,000 people in the street. And we had in a single weekend of protests around this country, about 200,000 people out in the streets, still very worried about COVID-19, wearing masks, trying to physically distance, etc., and doing it in the face of police attempts to suppress. So I think there is something new about this movement in the United States that has certainly, with young people, I think, inspired a global generation into renewed interest in street action, in popular struggle. So that's one source of confidence, I think. But another unexpected source of confidence, and I think if I can suggest that, as in different countries, we roll into the next big crisis, to look out for this, because we certainly saw in both the crisis around the fires in Australia and also to some degree in the current pandemic crisis, some extraordinary voluntary civic efforts around self-help, around people helping their neighbors, around people sort of stepping in where the state and where all the other institutions that were normally expected to do the job did not. Certainly in the case of fires, there were entire townships where the official emergency services just couldn't cope. And people actually had to organize themselves into special units to defend people's homes from fire. And later on, there was a lot of effort towards making sure that people who had lost their home had somewhere to stay, that food got delivered. And in fact, a lot of this happened for at least a period of 3 or 4 weeks before the military was mobilized to step in to do some of this aid work. So I think coming out of that, there's a certain amount of confidence that, we can do it. We can organize for ourselves. And therefore, hopefully, that's a bit of a building block. But I think the true consolidation of such efforts and such community efforts will come through sustained mass political movements. And I think something a bit like what we saw in Seattle recently around the Black Lives Movement, where, a certain part of Seattle, at least for a while, was kind of became a liberated zone, and people started to organize themselves on a community basis for their own security, but also to look after each other. New institutions of political power will come up in the process. And I think finally, in a way, I think the biggest problem that both Greta Thunberg mentioned, and I agree with this. The problem is that we can have a and basically an intellectual conversation like this, and perhaps come to agreement that objectively we need to have an eco-socialist. You don't have to call it eco-socialist, but we basically got to break the current economic and political system if we're going to move forward. We can come to that conclusion quite easily, but now how does a mass of people actually come to the same conclusion? And I think here's where I think, it's a bit of the challenge of embracing the crisis. And we have to have the confidence that in the process of going through a crisis, of organizing movements to deal, to take us through the crisis, to survive the crisis, to build something, it can also become a movement to build something new out of the crisis. What I'm saying is that in the process of movement building, especially if it's sustained and it's truly popular, many more people get a rapid political education. People who you may not have imagined would come to this conclusion in the space of a very short time, sometimes weeks, sometimes days, sometimes months, come to the conclusions that we have to break the capitalist system and we have to embrace an eco-socialist future. Now, in coming to this conclusion, of course, we have to learn, and I think this is the other thing we see is that when such popular movements come into being, when people go through a process of radical transformation in their thinking, etc., they're looking for ideas, they're looking for solutions, they're looking for, what's the way forward? And they're hungry for it. And this is the context, I think, where, there are many things that we can learn for. Well, first of all, you could say we can learn from the past. And even if from the past, learning from previous movements, a lot of it, certainly the movements for socialism, for communism, whatever, that the world has seen in the last 100 years, many of those lessons might be negative lessons, what not to do, or what we should not do, or what we should do differently, or what we should do better. So that's one source of lessons, history in that sense. But there are also lessons for more recent experiences and ongoing experiences from movements for revolutionary change. I think eco-socialists will be able to learn a lot from the experiences in Cuba, because they have been forced to survive through a lot of change and transformation. Eco-socialists can learn from the ongoing lessons from the Kurdish revolution in the north and east of Syria in Rojava, where you have a development of autonomy and of decentralized confederalist democracy. I think we can learn from that in the new movement. So to sum up then, that's about as much of a case for socialism I can make for you. I'm not sure whether it's really told you anything new. But I think we do have to embrace two things to sum up. One, we have to embrace that we are moving into a period of crisis. Out of crisis will come change, and out of change will come hope for the future. And finally, we feel a massive confirmation in this, and we should feel a massive confirmation in this, that future, call it eco-socialism, call it what you want, is now transformed from just a preferred imagined future, from even a moral choice, because it is unacceptable to accept what we have, to becoming a political, practical, and ecological necessity. Thank you. Up for discussion.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Peter. I think you, in a very calm manner, with your calm demeanor, explained to us the catastrophic consequences of our neglect of a couple of centuries particularly. And even more calmly, you have kind of laid out the roadmap in which we can come out of this mess we got ourselves into. Now, I have a problem with this sort of situation, because as you rightly said, the billionaires of the world have financialized the world, and they have ensured that the money they now control, the financial resources they now control, is technologically wired in ways that does not allow for democratization. So when we have this situation, is it at all possible for us to imagine a truly democratic? I mean, you mentioned Rojava in Syria and how remarkably resurgent and resilient that movement is of extricating itself from the most horrendous violence that evolved as a result of US policies and NATO and ISIS coming up there. Uh, and then they built this world for themselves in less than a decade, in which truly the Confederate democracy that uh, Öcalan talks about is in praxis there. It's a work in progress, and there are a lot of threats to it. So we have such uh, remarkable struggles, and you also spoke a lot about how Australia has come together, the farmers, the indigenous communities, and the urban communities coming together to draw a different narrative out of all this. But then we have the technology, which is so acutely controlled by the big five companies, and which has played such a disastrous role for even ritual democracies. So will they ever give us a chance to have actual democracy?
How do you prefer to do this? Will you have a few people say a few things and then
So we are also collecting a few questions, and we'll read out the
yes,
questions in a bit. So
and
we're
then
just
come back
allowing,
to me?
yeah, we'll come back to you. But I'm just trying to keep your, thoughts flowing meanwhile.
I
So,
can keep track of about 3 or 4.
okay. No, if possible to respond to this, and then I can bring
Oh,
the
okay,
others.
okay, sure. Um, I yes, I think there is a problem. Well, there are two problems. I mean, one problem is that we still live in a world broken into rich and poor countries between robber nations and robbed nations by and large. And these huge corporations, certainly the financial ones, their power is real, right? Um, and just as much as the huge concentration of military power in the hands of a few powers is real. And I think if, as you said, if you look at the case of Rojava Revolution, they're feeling it right now. They really are literally under the gun right now. And they feel like, it's the big powers that are really deciding. So basically the United States and Russia control critical airspace in northern Iraq and along the border between Syria and Turkey. And they are letting Turkey send jets across, they're letting armed drones go across and kill people. So, I mean, and, there's a technological gap there that all the bravery in the world struggles against. Because, an advanced fighter jet just sweeps in and bang. And even these drones now, drones actually made in Turkey with British technology, well, American technology going through Britain. They're deadly machines, and bravery has put up a big struggle against such inequality. And I guess financialization is, that could be a metaphor for financialization. But I think that the big lesson with financialization here is that we have to be wary about the money fetish. Uh, Financial transactions are actually a symbol for other things. The real stuff is what people do. And in the end, the power of finance capital, is basically the power to compel people to work for you. And I think one of the really interesting things about the COVID-19 crisis is that it kind of pulls the veil from the capitalist economy to a degree, because in the end, you know, like for a few weeks, I don't know what it was like in India, but certainly in Australia, for a few weeks, it was almost as though capital disappeared. You know, so our society was running on, well, who will do that and who will do this? There wasn't much investment going on. The companies, the corporations went into hibernation. Even the employees, well, certainly in Australia, you know, they were often subsidized by the state straight away. And you were thinking, well, you know, where is capital? I mean, now we do see it because they're trying to come back, you know, they're trying to come back and go back to business. I think to a degree, you know, that's calling the bluff, you know. So the power, for instance, of financial capital over the global south is essentially the power to extract debt repayment. Significantly, it is. You know, I'm not disputing that there is a value of capital. That, you know, like if you want to build infrastructure, you need capital because you need. But actually, you know, most of it actually is financial capital. Is basically says you owe me money, you pay me back, you keep paying me back for life. That's the guts of financial. The basic thing about financial capital, it's the capacity to make people pay back. It's all based on debt. The whole thing is it's a house of cards based on debt. And I think, you know, after the global financial crisis, we've seen the vulnerability of that financial capital as well. And I think there are challenges. I'm sure the challenge can't just be in the global south. You know, I think, you know, there has to be a concept of mutiny at the heart of the center of capital, you know, which is why I think that the transformation that we're looking ahead is truly going to be a global one, because the thing about the climate crisis is, as I said, it's just like COVID-19. It's not going to spare the rich countries. So they're going to be a crisis too. And therefore the prospect, if you like, of mutiny at the heart, at the belly of the beast, I think has to be part of our confidence for change. You know, in some ways, we're moving into, I think, a different kind of struggle to what took place for pretty much the last 100 years, you know, which is defined by anti-colonial, you know, anti-colonial struggles, you know, struggles for national liberation, you know. So basically it was the global south versus the imperialist countries, you know, the global north. I think the dynamics are changing here, even though the divisions still remain, and you know, and that's real. I think the dynamic of the new period of insurgency or rebellion that we are moving into is different. It's much more global, and therefore I think, you know, that in some ways that power of financial capital, is actually, you know, under threat, because simply because it's under threat everywhere. I hope that's, well, that's my hope anyway.
Leo, you have to unmute.
Ah, I'm
all
not
right.
muted.
Sorry, I was just saying that there are a bunch of questions that have already come in through the chat box. There's one that Rahul Datar has in 5 parts, but I'll ask him to sort of concisely put it across to you directly in a bit. So Rahul, just be ready. Meanwhile, I'll just read out a couple of questions which have come from different parts of the country. Vasant from Mysore, which is a city south of Bangalore, he says, in the interest of humanity, shouldn't we cap capital possession? So the question is it possible to imagine a world where such things, such instruments can be brought in through popular struggle. At the same time, Ratindra Jana says, the line between need and greed is disappearing, which is evident in consumerism and concentration of capital, and also intense competition for this in this space. So where is the chance for the larger ecological and environmental movements to succeed?
Okay. If I got that question right, I mean, what's the room for caps on capital accumulation? Is that what you're saying?
That's right. Not a tax, on a cap on capital accumulation. Is it possible
Yeah.
to imagine?
So I mean, yeah, the form in which that caps on capital accumulation have been raised have been various, including the billionaire tax, the idea basically of, I think Piketty has sort of raised sort of ideas of radical taxation. So I mean, you basically don't need. They could have 100% tax after a certain point in time. And I think in his earlier book, Piketty pointed out that, such taxes actually existed in some states in the United States of America up to the late 1950s. They actually existed. It was 100% tax after a certain level. I'm sure the capitalists found accountants who could get them to dodge that, but to some degree. But it's not an unreal expression. I do think that such demands are an essential part of moving forward. I guess because they tackle directly the question of inequality and start to erode this. And it also answers the question of how are you going to pay for this? You put forward an idea for, say, more public transport. How are you going to pay for it? And I agree. There should be various forms of tax the rich, and there should be radical taxes and severe taxation, and they should be justified on the basis that, look, these people don't need any more money. They're already filthy rich. They got much more than they need. Society needs it, and on the basis of social need, I think it's possible to popularize such demands. Consumerism and greed, and blurring the lines between need and greed. Well, that's that's the name of the game, isn't it? And it can get a bit depressing because it's in a world that's so unequal. They have managed to enlist the power of getting people to chase after inflated or false needs, and desires in an astounding way. So you can get, people basically with very little spending it on crap, or on really bad food, or food that's actually toxic and poisoning and things like that. I think it's very depressing every time you see that. And in fact, I think one of the most depressing things in modern society is a shopping mall. I think that they're extremely depressing things. They can be very depressing things to look at because they basically encapsulate. The modern shopping mall encapsulates this sort of organized madness that's fostered. But can it be broken down? I actually think it can be broken down quite fast. And I think, again, this is where, for us to do this, we do have to embrace the opportunity in crisis. Because in crisis, people very quickly begin to work out what the real needs are and what the false needs are. And I think we saw it to a degree in in the few weeks that when the COVID-19 crisis took place, people were making decisions about what were the priorities. And even now, actually, in Australia, the corporations in the retail sector actually having to work very hard to get people to go back into full shopping mode again. You know, they want people to go and shop, and you know, I'm not saying people are not shopping, but they have prioritized. So in crisis, people do make decisions about priorities, and the kind of dreamy world of consumerism, you know, is given a big shake-up. Uh, uh, so I think hope comes in that, and the rest of it, you know, if you like, the cultural change that has to come with, you know, to really have a sustainable future. I think that it is also one of those cultural changes that comes in the process of people participating in a mass movement for social change. Now, one example of this, I think, is if you look certainly in the Western world, and maybe you could say it's a global thing now, among a new generation of people coming into struggle, but also young people who are not actually involved directly in struggle, but are sympathetic with the struggle for environmental change, is the embrace of plant diets. I think it's an extraordinary movement that's actually going through right now. You know, my children's generation and you know, and grandchildren's generation, it's got a cut through which is extraordinary. And in some ways, I think it's a reflection of transformations. It's people thinking about, you know, how do they step lightly upon the earth? How do they minimize their... Sure, it's charged with a lot of moralism, but you know, moralism is nothing but an expression of what you think you should do, and it's not an individual decision of what you should do. It's often a collective thing. It's what we think with our overall framework of thinking, what we think is the right thing to do. And, you know, so to me, this is part of the cultural revolution that's happening as part and parcel of people relating to the crisis.
Thank you. I think on that note, Rahul Datar has a question which speaks to the last point you made. Rahul, would you like to briefly explain?
Yes. Thank you, Leo. Am I audible?
Very audible.
Yes, thank you. So at the onset, thanks, Peter, for the interesting talk and the points you made. My comment and the question is more actually triggered and inspired by the example that Leo gave at the beginning of the talk about this venture where creating mother's milk using chemical method or something which he mentioned about that. So that actually made me think about this other problem which is looming very large globally, is on the livestock and the meat processing sector, where we all know that things are raised. I mean, the livestock animals are raised and the numbers are increased using genetic modifications, hormone injections, chemical techniques, and different other technologies to basically increase their productivity, and so that they can feed more and more non-vegetarian eaters. And that, of course, has its own impacts of huge amount of fossil fuel burning, energy consumption, climate change impacts, which could be comparable to the transportation sector or the thermal power sector, as such. And not to mention the health impact because of this increase in hormones in the food, in the meat that we eat today. So, in fact, there have been reports in the recent pandemic where many of the livestock rearing companies and the owners had to cull a large number of animals because they simply did not have the resources to continue to feed the population, which ideally would have moved out on a routine basis in the non-COVID scenario. So with that kind of a backdrop, because of the sheer numbers and the demand that the markets have, do you consider that if we look at it from an eco-socialism perspective, do you think that vegetarianism or veganism is something that should be on the on the sunrise, and we should be looking at it as a viable option going ahead, or at least to balance our choices in terms of the vegetarian and the non-vegetarian? Of course, I would not disagree that vegetarianism also has its own impact, because you would also need to increase the load on the agriculture. So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Peter,
You know, I mean,
you have to speak a little louder. Some people are complaining
yeah,
your
okay.
audio is not. Yeah, you have to come closer to
Yeah.
the mic.
You know, I think it's just you could say if you look at it as a scientific basis. I mean,
Sorry, Peter, you're not audible. You'll have to speak louder or raise the mic closer to you.
How's that?
Maybe raise the
Is that
mic
better?
level or something.
Slightly better. Yeah.
That's better. I think there's no doubt that the modern, you know, if you like, modern meat industry, you know, it's a highly environmentally costly enterprise, and it is actually unsustainable. There's absolutely no doubt about that. I think that you know, there's a big argument. I mean, we were involved in working with a group of farmers who were trying to come up with you know, an ecologically sustainable farming principles, and they were not sort of like, you know, from the beginning they were not sort of absolutely, you know, on the totally vegetarian diet idea or against. In fact, one of these farmers who actually tried to put this together was actually, she considers herself as raising livestock in an organic and sustainable way. So they were coming from that point of view. But of course, one way or another, you look at it, even if you still have a you know, industry supplying food for meat eaters, if it was to be more ecologically sustainable, I think there is no doubt it would not be anything like the current system. But this question actually, in terms of popular consciousness, I think it's increasingly being posed as a moral issue. I think particularly for, as I mentioned, for young people, it's presenting as a moral issue. It's presenting as an issue of you know, it's the unsustainability or the cruelty of meat eating, and you know, I think it's a big element, and it's of a change. And I you know, well, I didn't start from the point of view of like vegetarianism as a moral choice. You know, I can see all the arguments for why it could be a political choice. And I think many people, in, you know, as they get more sensitive to ecological politics, actually will come to this, are coming to this conclusion. Some will also come to a very moral conclusion based on cruelty to animals very rapidly. Okay, that having been said, it doesn't finish off the question of making agriculture sustainable, because, you know, as you said, there's you know, that is also a challenge in the production of fruit and vegetables as well. So, you know, it's a big area. I agree. It's an increasingly important part of the movement. I haven't got the reference right yet, but I could refer you to the book that we've put together, and we are actually going to start a series of the people who wrote the book, the farmers who wrote the book, are going to start a series of online seminars shortly. And so I will pass my contact details if you are interested in participating.
Sure, thank you so much.
Thank you. Peter, I think more people are now complaining your voice is not being heard here. Is there some way you can try and see if the microphone is close to you? And
okay.
Yeah, that's
I'll try
better.
and change the settings as well.
Yeah, okay. So that would help. In fact, if you go to your Zoom settings and increase the input of the mic, that might help. Okay, now there are a couple of questions which sort of follow up on what you just said, and let me just build on that. One is from Suhas, and she says, shouldn't we, in that sense, to also make a political choice of decentralizing food production system, be it animals, be it meat or vegetables or eggs or whatever, milk and so on, and that could be achieved by making a strategic argument against cold chains. Because if you see what's happening around the world is that farmers are being spoken to about the importance of uh, supporting and investing in cold chain systems. Now that's carbon intensive, we know that. And that's not how the world operated for the most time. But there's also the question of food security, that if you suddenly make a transition away from the current industrialized systems, there could be chaos. So while these imaginaries are powerful, how does one make a transition, especially through decentralized systems?
Yeah, actually, I'm not sure really how. I think it really depends on the context. You know, that is. I mean, I think that if you like the political cultural context within which these, if you like, decentralized producers, agricultural producers, will be operating. You know, like what is the dominant, the current, you know, level of thinking, and I think there has to be some patience here. I think one of the lessons of all revolutionary transformations is that forcing farmers into forced collectivization was a historic disaster in Soviet Union and in China. And there's a broader lesson from that, and that is that you have to take people with you. So, you know, the broad discussion about ecology and transformation, you know, it's going to take a particular route, I think, and connected to how involved the people, because if we're talking about decentralized, we're talking about small farmers, basically smaller farmers. Is that what you mean, small producers? And well, it depends. Were those small producers actually involved in a campaign to liberate themselves from agribusiness, from well, urban landlords perhaps, or from people in the supply chain? I mean, in Australia, for instance, you know, we have a highly centralized retail sector, and basically two huge corporations dictate the prices of farm produce, and it creates a situation where it's actually set up for the farmers to actually, the smaller farmers at least, to have a big fight with the fights around the character of the produce and the pricing of the produce. So out of that struggle could come a discussion about what we produce and how we produce. And I think that's where it will be settled. You know, we might have we might have preferences on where it should go, but I think we have to be understanding that in the end that change has to be organically driven through the movement of small farmers. Now, it might mean that actually at a certain stage it poses, when does the organization of that sector happen? I mean, I know there might be pre-existing organization, but organization of those sectors in the context of the transformations that are being made, that will have to be made in the future as a result of climate change. So I think it's hard for us to predict, but I think what we can predict is that it's true that engagement where those producers will think about, you know, not just you know, a fairer deal for themselves, but also the question of what we produce. See, it's analogous to the situation of workers. So currently, you know, the way that the capitalist class actually seeks to turn many working class people and trade unions against the environmental movement is they say, oh, it's jobs or it's the greenies, you know, it's the environmentalists. And but there has to be a challenge to that. One of the ways we use to explain it is we say, look, the future is not only about whether you have a job or not, but also what are you doing in the job? What's the job about? What are you producing? You know, what's the end of it? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? You know, this is an issue for the worker. The worker's not just interested in getting, you know, getting a job and getting paid, regardless of what they do. Particularly, you know, if part of the struggle for the producer or for the worker is not only economic security, so I think that might be the sort of the baseline to start from, but also fulfillment in life, sense of meaning in job, in livelihood, all these things, you know, they are real issues, and they shouldn't be underestimated, because even in the most the most basic of jobs, you know, I think it's a long tradition that you know, many workers took pride in doing their job well, and you know, I see this as both a real factor and something to build on and to grow in the future, because it's something to appeal to in politics. So I think this works both, you know, we're talking about a worker, wage earner, or a small producer.
Karthik has a question about your first point on how to make the transition towards eco-socialism. You'd like you to explain how does one make a transition in the energy sector from what is predominantly privatized energy production and transmission to distribution to back to the public sector. Now, I would like to add to this that India today has a major revision of the Electricity Act pending before Parliament. And the revision is such that it effectively takes away not just the control, whatever little control is left in public sector or energy production, but it goes to the extent of creating institutional infrastructure which would effectively nullify judiciary getting into the system to set right inequities. In fact, it centralizes that arbiter to such an extent that energy production and transmission will entirely become corporatized and commodified. And it's really when the corporates start feeling upset that the arbiter is likely to be invoked to set right the dispute. So the people are completely out of the picture. And people's needs are obviously not considered. So this is how far India is willing to go if this new bill, which is pending before Parliament, is passed. So can you speak to this very, very serious concern? I'm sure it's also a global phenomenon of taking away power from public sector, not just in energy, but also in other sectors, and putting it in the hands of the private sector, the giant corporations, especially the ones which are amalgamated and so on. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I don't think there's any alternative to building a movement around the demands to nationalize these sectors completely. I mean, that's got to be a starting point. Now, whether you can win such a struggle or not, I guess it depends on you know, how much people feel threatened by the privatization or the private how the private companies are running those sectors. I mean, in Australia, for instance, the privatization of the energy sector is a relatively recent thing. It took place over the last decade, and it took place a bit like in India, with the state, with the governments actually forcing it through, you know. But one of the first things that has happened now, after 10 years, we have completely undeniable evidence that the actual price of energy has not gone down but gone up. You know, because that was one of the arguments they used, is that if you privatize the sector, broke it up, there'll be competition and the price will come down. The opposite has happened. Secondly, the reliability of the privatized service has been called into question. because they do all sorts of things to try and play the market, and they've actually burnt themselves a few times. They've had big blackouts and power failures, and it's basically come down to these to money making that has actually caused this blackout. They've tried to blame perversely. They've tried to blame renewable energy in some cases, but there's definitely a debate about that. The same thing has happened here in public transport, because they have privatized certain train services, and then sometimes they've been so badly managed they've had to be renationalized, and then they try to reprivatize again. So in this toing and froing, people can come to understanding it's wrong. In some ways, you could say that increasingly, because we find governments kind of having to intervene so strongly to ensure the privatization, or to compel the privatization of entire sections of the economy, you could see this as a form of desperate measures. It's a bit like all the regional trade deals that are being done now, where they're basically trying to, if you like, circumvent existing laws to create a new legal situation to cement in private interests. And so on one hand, these are very threatening things, but they do depend in the end on individual governments actually implementing them. And I think in a point, in times of crisis, you can see how shaky this power actually is. Currently, it's a combination of COVID and also of increasing trade tensions between the United States and China, but also the United States and Europe. You can see that some of these deals that were done, they're not actually as secure as they think they were. In the end, if governments refuse to abide with them, particularly bigger governments, then their viability is in severe doubt. Don't really function at all. So I think you can see this. You could see this either as a high point of capital power. You can see it as a desperate measures to prop up a system, especially a system which can be increasingly a capitalist system, which can increasingly seen as extracting payments, extracting unproductive rents, if you like, from the system. The case of patents and copyrights, is a good case in point, particularly when it comes to medicine. As you have a crisis, like it becomes less politically viable. For instance, in the COVID crisis, for private companies to say, oh, look, we found the vaccine, but we're only going to sell it to very rich people. I don't think it's going to be sustainable. I'm not going to say they won't try it, but there are political pressures as well, and I think political movements can be built against that. And so that, in the same way, I think a lot of these state laws that try and enforce privatization, they actually might represent a vulnerability of the system, and that if a political campaign can be built up that's strong enough, they can be pushed aside quite quickly.
Would you like to share something about what's going on with the Adani plant and how the movement is building up? Because, Adani is not our favorite guy in India, but is Narendra Modi's favorite. And we're sorry, since our country won't apologize to you, we will on our country's behalf for what's going on there. But what's happening there?
You don't have to take responsibility for your billionaires.
Of course not. Yeah. Yeah, but that's the kind of extractive technology and extractive economic systems where we get coal from your country to burn it here, and we basically mess it up. And uh, it's so
Yeah.
simple to see it at one level that this is wrong. This should not be
Well,
sustained.
it's actually worse than, it's actually even worse than that, because the movement here is actually quite a well-organized one, and it's got many wings, and it's got a section of the movement that looks very carefully at all the legalities and all the economic aspects of the mine that Adani is building, and it is looking like a very uneconomic venture. It actually, its economic viability is significantly depending on Australian government subsidies. So, and that case has actually been quite clearly made out. And so we think, well, why would an Australian government want to spend billions of dollars to subsidize a foreign billionaire to come and invest in fossil fuel, which is, even from the market point of view, it's got a limited shelf life, and partly it seems to be, a very peculiar case of a whole chain of what's called stranded interests. So Adani is copying all the. He's the one who's identified, because he's the front running investor in what is potentially a huge mega coal mine area. It's a basin in Queensland, and so he's sort of like being used as a spearhead to open up exploitation, possibly a very uneconomic without government subsidy exploitation, because it's quite in a remote area. They have to build big rail lines and ports, etc., to take the coal to the port and send it out. But behind them, behind Adani, are some of the, well, it was the richest woman in Australia, Gina Reinhardt, is one of the forces that also has a stake in coal deposits in that area. And she's just in the background waiting for Adani to take the brunt of the pressure, to get the government subsidies, open the rail lines and the ports, etc. And then she and other Australian billionaires who are hiding in the background, have their future mines to come. But all this is stacked up as, one unsustainable mine after another, because each will require more and more government subsidies as the price of the competitors to coal keep going down. And also as the pressures because of climate change, on coal exports going to be stronger and stronger. So I think this is where the game is right now. It's an ongoing campaign. It's been kept a bit quieter because of the pandemic, but I think it's the fight's still on. It's not anywhere over, and it is peculiar actually that it's Adani who's actually playing this particular role. It's a very political role. I'm not sure of the full backgrounds of how he ended up being in that position. What's the deal with the Australian government over this? What's the payoff, etc. But undoubtedly, there are lots of secret dirty deals, behind this. But it's a very political investment. It's not a clear-cut investment that it's just easy money. It's not easy at all. So far, the only money he's getting is sort of the big subsidies. That's the only money coming in. All the rest of it is borrowed money that's going in there. Now, if the venture collapses, I guess people who suffer will be the financial institutions. So this then enlists the powerful financial institutions in the political fight as well. So we often understand here, whenever we see the extraction sector, what we are confronting is we're not confronting a group of mining companies. We are actually confronting the finance companies. because all the extraction sectors have got the highest leverage you can imagine. It's all other people's money. It's government money and it's borrowed money that's going into these ventures. So you have to know who your enemy is, and our enemy here is financial institutions. And what the movement has done is the movement has just targeted, it's got one bank after another. We hit one bank, and then we put a lot of pressure, and then the bank says, oh no, okay, we won't lend the money. Then there's another bank, and basically, I think we've gone through about, maybe about 10 banks already. And each one of them has been forced to buckle and to pull out. But then there's always another bank and another bank. And it keeps going on like that. And the fight is even going down to the insurance companies. Which insurance company will insure this bit of the venture and that bit of venture. Every day this last week, there has been protest action outside one of these subsidiaries. So it's a kind of like a guerrilla campaign. It's going at that level currently. I don't know whether the Indian government is playing on this, but I think at one stage, they were trying to say, oh, this is a sort of anti-Indian racism or something. I don't think this is the case at all. The movement has been very, very determined here to bring up all the stories about the bad things that Adani's company has done in India.
Thank you. I think the last question I'll let Bhargavi ask you directly. Bhargavi, please.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you, Peter. That was a brilliant talk. So, we find that capitalists are finding newer and newer ways everywhere to trick the system, and especially when it comes to resources, be it water, be it coal, and now even in the renewable energy sector, they have completely tricked the system. They are the ones who have access to finance. They have got into processes where the governments are favoring them, making land available, and the governments everywhere are creating agencies and institutions to make it easy for these capitalists. So the constitutional processes everywhere are getting eroded. There is no space for a democratic discussion. And so what is the way forward, and how do we deal with this? Yeah.
Yeah, no, the funny thing about, I think it's a peripheral part of your question, but, about 20 years ago, I had a conversation with a former regional manager of Exxon. He had left, and after spending years and years based in Hong Kong running it, and was disillusioned, and he changed his whole life. He dropped out of the corporate, that sort of corporate role, and we were having a talk about renewable energy, and he said, never make the mistake that these big companies like Exxon are not interested in renewable energy. So we are very interested in it. We have been, well, not we, said Exxon is very interested in it. In fact, Exxon's got amazing plans for renewable energy. They just want to use up the other stuff first, sell the other stuff first, and then they will go into renewable energy. And basically that's what we're looking at. I think we're looking now at a point in time where, and this is where it is a bit of a choice for environmentalists. Like if you think it's all the technology and oh, well, green technology is great, you'll be kidding yourself, because it's in the end the same big corporations are seeking to get themselves into a monopoly position into the forms of energy that will replace fossil fuels eventually. But at the same time, they have locked in so much investment in this in the fossil fuel sector. They also want to exploit that as much as possible, and using any kind of excuse. In Australia, I mean, it's increasingly hard to put a public excuse for, say, coal extraction, except all it means jobs, and that's about the last argument that's left. But the gas sector, which is the growing sector of fossil fuel exports in Australia, they keep saying, oh, we are a transition fuel. So they're actually, kind of like trying to play the game of saying that they are part of greening capitalism. I have no faith in the greening of capitalism. So I think we'll be up against fundamentally the same forces, sooner or later, who will be consider themselves to be the renewable energy giants, etc., unless there's a bigger transformation. I don't think that there's any simple answer to this question of it's actually the closing up legal space, I guess, is what you're talking about. Different countries, they obviously there's a different kind of situation. They are definitely trying to, bolster their capital is trying to protect itself more and more. Actually, I think this is the peculiar thing about the stage of capitalism we're at. It becomes so concentrated, and yet it is actually more dependent on state support and state subsidy, I think, than it was in an earlier stage of capitalism. In fact, there are entire sectors of the entire corporations who basically are making their money out of, if you like, not really a very productive activity, but by getting state governments to hand over, in part, the power of taxation. So the classic thing, of course, is a tollway company with a road tollway. I mean, basically, they have got a government contract to extract taxes. A very old-fashioned tax. It's the kind of tax that at the beginning of capitalism they try to get rid of, because villagers would put toll bridges up outside their village and try or towns and take a tax from merchants, whoever was going up and down, and that was considered to be a restraint on trade. And early capitalism smashed that down and put a monopoly of taxation in the central government, because they thought that'd be more efficient for trade. Now it's the other way around. Now they're trying to get that as a form of money making, because they don't have confidence to invest money in production, because they're not sure whether they can sell their stuff. And I think that this is the vulnerability of modern capitalism. It's quite tied up with the state in that sense. So if the state actually is discredited, then capital can fall with it quite fast. And this is not such an impossible thing, because in this process of consolidating large corporations, consolidating or becoming embedded and interlinked with the state itself, there's always a stink of corruption, because it's actually implicitly corrupt. It's implicit, it's intrinsically corrupt. And I think that's a big vulnerability of modern capitalism. Although it sort of has the power of the state, it can send the police down to do the dirty job. Always did, but now it's got laws written to favor it, etc. Politically, that can be a point to attack as well from a popular movement, because it's corruption. And in the end, they can't resist it, can they? The politicians, they know they are in this position, and they're in the position of being bribed, and therefore they take the money. And the kind of people who are attracted to that sort of position are the crooks. So it becomes a crooked state working with crooked corporations. And I think that's the way we're going to fight them. We're going to have to build a movement that says we're sick of it. We're sick of the crooks. I think that will be. You can already see in popular movements that rise. Actually, even right-wing movements that have risen. That the anti-corruption elements big part of it. And there's a reason for that, because ordinary people can see the corruption that's implicit in this link between capital and the state.
Thank you.
That's a very, very positive note, because I think you took Bhargavi's question, which pointed to the depressing situation, political, economic, and you have turned it into a call for resistance. And I think that's the kind of resistance we need to expose the deeply corrupt capitalist system. And I think it's by design and by its very nature corrupt and inhumane and totally against the way of living with this planet. And I feel that it's that kind of note which actually energizes our thinking as we do our work to try and deal with the situation, but also try and imagine the future. You started with a sign of hope because a young woman has taken upon herself to imagine. And by imagining, she's also dreaming, and she's trying to put down her dreams in particular forms of resistance to the current prevailing system, right? So I think all this comes together, and we're really, really grateful that you made time to share some of your thoughts. I would encourage those of us who are listening to take a look at the Green Left journal. It's online. You just have to Google Peter's name, Peter Boyle, and you'll find it. It's a remarkable collation of such inspiring writings. And thanks, Peter, for making time. I know it's pretty late for you there, but thanks for staying back with us. This video will be up online maybe by tomorrow, and please share this video so that this rich discussion we have had can reach many others as well. We're sorry it didn't get on to Facebook. We tried YouTube as well. That didn't work. There's something wrong there. So I guess that's a sign of how giant corporations are limiting the power of Zoom. But then there we are. We will always make it possible to reach it out. Bhargavi, would you like to introduce the next topic and then we can close?
Yeah, so stay tuned, everybody. Next week we have Dr. Manju Reddy, a psychiatrist, and I think the pandemic has brought in enough challenges to all of us who are locked down with mental health issues. So the next theme we are taking up is mental health. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
For sharing.
And thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone. See you again next Friday, 5 p.m. India time. Bye.